Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 108. Our show today is the final episode in this series on the mollusk clade. Today, we'll be looking at the relationship between mollusks and humans. Now, as we go on and explore more animal clades, each series will end with an episode like this, where we explore how humans have interacted with, perceived, and used these animals. The mollusks are quite fascinating in this regard, because they're so utterly alien compared to the familiar vertebrates and arthropods. Consider all of the major groups that we've explored in this series: the worms and chitons, the slugs and snails, the bivalves and the cephalopods. None of these animals can be used for labor, like an ox or a dog. None of them are domesticatable, and even if they were, it's doubtful they'd make good pets. None of them can run fast on dry land. None of them are particularly cuddly, and a great many of them are dangerous, as they produce various mixtures of toxins, like the neurotoxin tetrodotoxin, that can seriously harm or kill an adult human. The chitons and the cephalopods are entirely aquatic, and the gastropods are easily overlooked in their forest, grassland, wetland, garden habitats. The gastropods are definitely more familiar, but they don't exactly look or behave like any other mollusk, and early civilizations thought that they were a kind of strange worm, like an earthworm, but bigger and weirder. Only the bivalves are relatively easy to find in large numbers, and even then only near the coast. For this reason, the bivalves are the most familiar mollusk clade. In terms of their economic value and material uses, the bivalves have been disproportionately popular with humans since antiquity. Let's rewind the clock a bit and go back several 100,000 years, when the earliest ancestors of anatomically modern humans were migrating out of Africa. Over thousands of years, some groups went south. Other groups went north. The land corridor passing through the Sinai Peninsula was a major locus of migration, as peoples traveled through this region on their way north into Europe, or east into Greater Asia. Many peoples traveled over dry land, but other groups traveled by boat, hugging the coastline and hopping from island to nearby island. Paleontological and ethno-ecological data suggest that a major coastal thoroughfare existed from East Africa to the archipelagos of Southeast Asia and Greater Australia. Many human population groups used this coastal highway to skirt the northern edges of the Indian Ocean, with some splinter groups breaking away at points to settle coastal areas or move inland, following some river or seeking the refuge of a verdant valley. Some of these peoples went further south into Australia and further east into the islands of the South Pacific, while other peoples went north or northeast into Central Asia and the Far East, into the Great Northern Plain of China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and Siberia, wherein even more peoples moved across the Bering Land Bridge into an ice-coated North American continent. Another major dispersal into Europe would see peoples settle all the way to the Atlantic coast, from the Iberian to the Scandinavian peninsulas. During these many millennia of travel and dispersal, these human population groups would have fed upon the marine creatures that were available to them. While at sea, people could catch fish with nets and line, and they could catch birds with bows and arrows. On land, they could hunt larger vertebrate animals and gather all manner of vegetables, fruits, tubers, woods, and other plant parts. In coastal areas around lakes and rivers and the intertidal zones of the great oceans, ancient humans found rich clusters of bivalves clinging to the wave-beaten rocks. These fields of bivalves were harvested for food, as each shell could be pried open to reveal the soft visceral mass, the fleshy part of the bivalve's body. As a food source, they were so popular with early humans that many areas were overforaged, their bivalve stocks depleted or dispersed outwards to other habitats with fewer people. Clams, oysters, scallops, and mussels are all relatively low in calories, but they make up for it in other ways. the mussels, scallops, and clams are pretty protein-rich, and the mussels, clams, and oysters are excellent sources of mineral nutrients like zinc, selenium, manganese, magnesium, phosphorus, and iron, as well as vitamins C and B12. As substrate-dwelling filter feeders, you might think that they would accumulate toxic metals and contaminants, but the reality is actually the opposite, as these filter feeders are specialized to keep harmful chemicals, like mercury, out of their bodies. In this regard, the tissue of the bivalve is actually generally cleaner and less contaminated than the surrounding habitat. If they do happen to ingest some of these toxic chemicals, they usually get integrated into the shell, and the shell isn't eaten, so it's not really a matter of concern for the humans who hunt them. Ancient humans would have found these bivalves to be a very convenient food source, as they can't run away, the shell can be easily cracked open with a human's dexterous fingers, and the shell acts like a spoon or a plate for the small bit of protein inside. The meat can be accompanied by various sauces and vegetables, either roasted or fresh, or the meat can even be turned into chowders and sauces. The cultivation and farming of bivalves, like abalone, has been practiced for thousands of years. In the tide pools alongside the bivalves, ancient humans would have also found edible species of limpets and sea snails, and further inland they would have found edible terrestrial snails. Although the gastropods are certainly more mobile than the bivalves, they're still quite slow by human standards, and they're easy to forage and gather. Perhaps the most popular dish with snail meat is escargot. The typical recipe involves cooking the snail either in or out of its shell, and then putting it back in the shell along with a mixture of butter, spices, sauces, garlic, nuts, or whatever other ingredients. In France, where escargot is especially popular, the species most frequently served at dinner is the Helix pomatia, or the Roman snail. Ancient humans would have quickly learned how wise it is to thoroughly cook your mollusk meat, because mollusks, like snails, are notorious carriers of parasites and diseases. For example, schistosoma flukes are parasitic worms that infest snails during their larval stage. For some reason, they have to go through the snail's body as part of their development, and when they come out, they're ready to infect mammals. In humans, schistosomiasis is an infection caused by the schistosoma flukes in the intestines. It can cause intense inflammation, fluid buildup, internal bleeding, and a lot of pain, and it's estimated to affect approximately 200 million people in tropical areas across the world. However the clam, oyster, mussel, scallop, or snail is eaten, when the meal is over, the leftover shells take on a whole new value. Bivalve shells have a curling, sheet, or plate-like shape. They can be integrated into clothing, like scales, or as dangling ornaments, like earrings. Some cultures have used bivalve shells as a canvas, with ink illustrations or carvings made along the inner surface. The shells of marine and terrestrial snails are more bulbous, twisting, and conical. Depending on the species, the shell can be quite large and ornamented. Ancient humans found these items to be practical and beautiful, and crafted them into various ornaments and artistic items. Perhaps the most unique use is found in the conch shells, which have the right acoustics to be converted into horns or trumpets. Cultures from around the world have used conch shells for just this purpose. Another widespread practice has been the use of mollusk shells as a currency, or some sort of tradable commodity. The shells were often beautiful objects to have around your home, especially the really big ornate ones. And simply possessing a giant snail shell was its own kind of marker of social status. These giant shells could be polished to highlight the elegant suture patterns, and across Africa and the southern and eastern reaches of Asia, cowrie shells have been a popular currency for trading for centuries. Scaphopods, which have hollow tube-like shells with openings at either end, became popular items to use in jewelry and clothing, as string could be easily slipped through them to link them together into bracelets or necklaces, or even to weave them into sheets or clothes. Speaking of weaving and textiles, mollusks do something that's super weird and super cool that I never knew about before I researched this. There's apparently a family of saltwater clams known as the Pinidae, or the pen shells, and they use an unusual gland in their foot to secrete a sticky, fibrous substance. This fibrous tuft is used to anchor the tip of the shell to rocks in the intertidal zone. The fibrous tuft can be harvested, and the long, super tough fibers can be spun into a rare and expensive fabric. Now, if this was just some average quality fabric, it would still be pretty awesome. I mean, what a wild way to get material for a textile, right? Like, it's still a really crazy material that your shirt or your pants or your socks or whatever are made out of. It would still be awesome. I mean, these clams are basically like giant silkworms of the sea. But it's even more awesome than that, because this sea silk, as it's called, has extremely fine fibers, so it can be woven into a smoother, silkier fabric than silk itself. It's lightweight. It can be folded and compacted very tightly and stored in a proportionately small volume. And the fabric itself is not just soft and comfortable, it's even really warm and fashionable. Not that I know anything about fashion, but apparently treating the fibers with lemon juice produces a golden color that's really pretty, and it doesn't fade. This molluscian sea silk has been used to make highly valuable garments for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks and Arabs called it sea wool. The ancient Romans called it pinna wool. The ancient Chinese called it mermaid silk. Wherever you went in the ancient world, and today for that matter, clothing that's made from this clam-derived sea silk is seen as universally valuable. Unfortunately, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the pen shells have been heavily damaged by human activity and overfishing. Both the bivalves that produce the silk and the industry that uses the silk to make fabric are on the verge of extinction. Today, the art of weaving sea silk is practiced by only a small handful of specialists on a small Mediterranean island. Yet another bivalve contribution to fashion and wealthy extravagance can be seen in the pearl. Many mollusks can produce pearls, or pearl-like masses, but the only ones that have been extensively used by humans and that have any real economic value are the shiny white pearls produced by the few mollusks with nacre lining the inside of their shells. Nacre is a composite material made of columns of aragonite embedded in a matrix of elastic, organic polymers. It has a beautiful iridescence, which is what makes it so attractive as a material for jewelry. Nacre has been used to decorate all manner of things, from furniture to instruments to various household items and even weapons. So you'll have a bivalve hanging out in the ocean, minding its own business, filter feeding through one siphon and excreting waste out of the other siphon, when a grain of sand or some kind of particle slips in between the hard shell and the soft mantle. This particle will become coated in layer upon layer of this nacreous material, until, like a small bit of snow rolling downhill, it becomes a large, bright white orb. This is the pearl. When you open up a bivalve, for example, like the pearl oyster Pinctatum hortensi, you may see a shiny white pearl sitting near the visceral mass. Humans have collected these pearls for millennia, gathering them to integrate them into jewelry or clothing or artwork. The effort that it took to collect the pearls, segregate the high-quality pearls from the lower-quality pearls, and then build some sort of jewelry or art with it meant that many of these pearl items, like necklaces or artwork or whatever, were very valuable. Now, modern technology has allowed us to make artificial pearls, which are no less beautiful because they're made of the exact same stuff, but they've certainly reduced the monetary value and the implied social status of pearls. Speaking of wealth and social status, consider the color purple. Up into the medieval ages, and even today, the color purple has been associated with royalty, with nobility and power. This association, which exists in multiple cultures, can be traced back to the origination of the first viable purple dye, called Tyrian purple, or imperial purple. The exact process by which it was originally made is not fully understood, but we do have, from the historical record, some important details. The practice of collecting materials and making Tyrian purple may have originated with the Minoans on Crete and spread to Tyre in Lebanon and Carthage along the north coast of Africa. These Mediterranean peoples collected the murex snails of the family Muricidae, and they extracted an organ called the hypobranchial gland. These glands were gathered in a vat, salted, mixed with some potash, and heated or boiled in an alkaline stew-like solution that made the pigments seep out from the tissue. After the salting, but before the heating, apparently the glands have to sit for a few days and basically ferment in the vat, which reportedly creates this unbearable stench. The upper layers of the stew are scraped away, and what remains is a deep red or blackish purple soup that can be used to make deep red, scarlet, purple, deep blue, and black dyes. That classic Tyrian purple, a result of the high concentration of the product 6,6'-dibromo indigo in the solution, was considered the ideal final product of the process. As you could probably imply, this process is extremely energy-intensive. Each individual snail produces only a minute amount of the necessary chemicals, so hundreds of thousands of snails are needed to produce significant quantities of Tyrian purple dye. It's been estimated that to dye the trim or the edges of a single article of clothing, so not just the entire shirt or whatever, but just the trim of it, you would have to harvest something like 10 to 12,000 snails. The extreme labor required to gather all these snails and harvest all of the the tiny little glands made the process exorbitantly expensive, which is why only the wealthiest of the wealthy could afford purple-dyed clothing, and why the color has been widely associated with royalty, wealth, and power. It was also expensive due to its quality. The color didn't fade, but it actually got deeper and more robust with time. So the recipe for this extremely expensive Tyrian purple involves the extracted hypobranchial gland of these murex snails. Interestingly, the hypobranchial gland is the same organ, albeit slightly modified through evolution, that the cephalopods use to produce their ink. These are homologous organs, and like the murex snails' glandular secretions being used to make the dye, so too is the ink of the squid and the octopus used to make ink. This may seem pretty mundane, but just think for a moment how important this is. As our primitive civilizations developed writing systems and ways of encoding information, we needed a medium to write in, to record this information down so it could be read by someone else in a different place. No longer was it necessary for instructions to be passed along verbally or orally. Oral history became one of several options, the other options including various forms of writing, of information recording in a long-term format. Ancient Mesopotamians used cuneiform carvings in clay tablets. This was a functional but heavy and inefficient medium. Textile engineering would produce papyrus and other forms of early paper. And while you couldn't carve into these lighter, more efficient mediums, you could write on them with ink. Information storage became more efficient, both in terms of the medium itself being written on and in the form of the written language itself. However, ink was relatively expensive for a long time, as gathering it from all of these cephalopods was no easy task. Speaking of the cephalopods, I've kind of left them out so far into the episode. This wasn't really intentional, as I was just trying to make a nice segue from food to shells, and cephalopods don't have shells, so they were kind of bumped to the side for a minute, but it should go without saying that cephalopods have also been a popular source of food throughout history. Perhaps the most iconic food is calamari, the East Asian dish of fried squid or fried octopus. Cephalopod ink isn't really used for writing anymore, but it is used in Japan to make food coloring and flavored sauces. Now, the bivalves have been popular across human history in a variety of different human cultures due to their ubiquity, their nutrient content, and the many valuable things they produce, such as pearls, their beautiful shells, and that super weird sea silk. In contrast, the gastropods and the cephalopods have significantly different cultural reputations. Consider first the gastropods. These are soft, dim-witted, slow-moving creatures with poor eyesight. These unattractive qualities have been the source of epithets, of insults across human societies, where someone may be compared to a snail if they are slow and inefficient. Culturally, the snails and the slugs aren't particularly intimidating or charismatic creatures, so they tend to be seen humorously. For example, there are many medieval European manuscripts with small doodles in the margins depicting cartoonish knights fighting giant snails. Similarly, cartoonish depictions can be found throughout history up to the modern day. Now consider the cephalopods. These things aren't cute. They're not goofy. They're not funny. They're terrifying. They're monstrous in appearance, and many species can grow to monstrous sizes. All seafaring peoples are familiar with the creatures of the sea, but there are few animals that have a reputation as mysterious and fearsome as the giant squid. There's accounts going back into antiquity of sailors and their ships being attacked by colossal cephalopods, with arms exceeding 20 meters in length, and suckers the size of an Athenian shield. Many fantastic beasts from myth and folklore have been inspired by the cephalopods. The ancient kraken of Nordic lore and the gorgon of classical Grecian lore are legendary monstrous versions of the real thing. Many concepts of the archetypical sea monster portray some sort of giant squid or octopus-like thing. These illustrations typically depict the beast in the middle of an attack on a giant wooden sailing vessel, with its massive arms snapping masts in two and pulverizing the deck to splinters, where a number of hapless sailors are entangled in its grip or swept overboard into the sea. The tales and the legends of these aquatic creatures are familiar to every sailor and seaman from every human culture that has ever built boats and taken to the sea. Even today, the cephalopods inspire the look of terrible creatures and evil villains, from Davy Jones in Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean movies to Ursula in The Little Mermaid, to Dr. Octopus in the Spider-Man comics, and of course the great demonic Cthulhu from the grim stories of H.P. Lovecraft. Throughout history, from the first seafarers to the modern day, the cephalopods are typically seen as mysterious and fearsome creatures. Our forebears saw them as iconic of the implacable and merciless forces of nature, as some unstoppable monster that could come upon a ship at its most vulnerable, in open water, and pull them down into the dark deep. Today, we see them as less hostile and overtly dangerous and frightening, but perhaps leaning more so into the mysterious angle. They seem more cryptic and alien to us, iconic of some of the greatest mysteries of the natural world. This more modern perception of the cephalopods as something cryptic and alien can be seen in various manifestations and representations, but perhaps none as cool and interesting as the design of the aliens from that awesome 2016 movie, Arrival. But it's not all sea monsters and existential demons and bad guys. In some kid-friendly media, the cephalopod characters are depicted as benign or even friendly. Consider Pixar's Finding Nemo, where a father-daughter pair of flapjack octopus are depicted as just regular people in a coral reef community. And in the sequel, Finding Dory, there's an East Pacific red octopus character who's not depicted as monstrous per se, but who's definitely shown to be calculating, clever, and very goal-oriented. This is a clear depiction of cephalopod intelligence. And who can forget that pretentious but lovable square, Squidward tentacles, from the cartoon TV show SpongeBob SquarePants. And honestly, now that I think about it, it's really not that accurate for me to sit here and suggest that all ancient human cultures saw the cephalopods in a negative light. I mean, yeah, they're freaky and scary looking, but many cultures have elevated them to a place of honor and high esteem. The ancient Hawaiians, for example, have an ocean deity named Kanaloa, who often takes on the body form of an octopus. There's this fantastic Hawaiian creation myth that tells of an older world, a world destroyed by magical forces and turned to chaos, and from that chaos, a new world emerges. Everything in the old world was destroyed, except for one thing. Except for the octopus. Only the octopus remains from that old magical realm, as some kind of alien arbiter, a relic of a bygone cosmic era, now residing in and guiding our world as it turns the wheel of time. Other cultures, particularly those in and around the Pacific Ocean, also view the octopus positively, as a kind of animal shaman, a spiritual Sherpa that can heal and protect the soul. Now, I'm not too clear on the squid or the cuttlefish, but in many cultures, the octopus specifically is a symbol of spirituality, of creation, and persistence in an unforgiving world. Okay, let's take a moment here to recap what we've covered so far. We've explored how ancient humans would have interacted with mollusks, where they would have found them, what resources they could derive from the mollusks, and what they did with these resources. Ancient humans seemed primarily interested in bivalves, probably due to their abundance near coastal areas, where large groups of people would have also lived. Bivalve meat was a popular foodstuff, and the shells could be used as currency, as jewelry, as art, either by using the shell as a base medium for sculpture, by creating illustrations along the smooth inner surface, or by removing the nacre and using it to decorate some other object. Particular species of bivalve also produced valuable items in the form of pearls and sea silk. Gastropods were also popular foods, and their shells had some specific uses too, such as making conch trumpets. The cephalopods were much less useful to ancient man, primarily because they lacked any kind of hard shell, but also probably because they're fewer in number and much harder to catch. Notice that ancient humans could really only use the tangible, macroscopic parts of the mollusks. They could only really eat the meat and make crafts with the shells, pearls, and other large, solid parts. For thousands of years, there was no real way for us to understand the cellular dynamics and the biochemistry of these creatures in any detail. We could see the symptoms of poisoning when someone was bit or stung by a cone snail or a blue-ringed octopus or something, but the structure of the poisonous compounds, their mechanism of action within our body, the metabolic pathways within the mollusk body that produce them, all of this stuff was a mystery to us, until we developed powerful enough technology that could sufficiently analyze the cells and the molecules and the mechanisms of action. I bring this up because with the advent of modern technology, with spectroscopes and genome sequencing and assays and histograms and X-ray protein crystallography, we've been able to rapidly learn more about the cellular and biochemical dynamics of the mollusks, and this, in turn, has opened up new frontiers in other fields of science. For example, we can use bivalves like clams and oysters as biomonitors. Because these animals are immobile and utterly exposed to their environment, if conditions change or new contaminants come in, they can't run away. They have to face the challenge head on. So, by measuring populations of bivalves, such as their density, their abundance, and any trace chemical pollutants found in their tissues, like in their shells, we can make detailed inferences about the health of the habitat as a whole. This has led environmental regulators and scientists alike to think about using bivalves as biomonitors near industrial sites or near areas of pollution, where they can be used to gauge contamination and the progress of cleanup efforts. This would be a biological way to measure these things without relying on the word of the company or the facility that's being monitored. Consider another example. For my graduate degree, I studied behavioral neuroscience, and one of the more fascinating things that I learned while taking classes in my degree program was about the history of research with the giant squid axon. Without getting too sidetracked in the neurological details, you should understand that our neurons send chemical signals or action potentials down the axon. The axon is that really long limb extending out from the cell body. I talk about this a lot more and in more detail in my previous episodes on the animal nervous system. Anyway, the speed of these chemical signals that get sent down the axon, the speed depends on several things, including the diameter of the axon and whether or not it's myelinated. You can think of it kind of like electrical wiring. If you want to reduce resistance in your wires, you can insulate them with some kind of rubber, or you can make them thicker, increase the cross-sectional area of the wire. The same is true for axons. If you increase the myelination, or increase the axon diameter, you can increase the speed of the action potential. Now, giant squid axons are unmyelinated, so to make up for this lack of insulation, to have somewhat reasonably speedy action potentials, they've developed axons, particularly in the nerve connecting to their enormous eyeballs, that are huge. They have a massive cross-section. This is great for neurologists, as the giant squid axon is an extremely useful tool for research. It can be seen with the naked eye, which means that you don't need a whole suite of fancy microscopes and micro tools to work with it. It's unmyelinated, which means we don't have to cut through lipid-rich layers of membranous wrapping just to get to the cell surface itself. And because the entire surface is coated in ion channels and receptors and whatnot, the giant squid axon is basically an optimized neurological workbench, where receptor modulators can be tested and ion channels can be isolated and measured with various patch clamp techniques. The field of neurology has jumped ahead by leaps and bounds because of the giant squid axon. Much of what we know about neural function, like the chemistry of action potentials, the dynamics of receptors and ion channels, and the holistic activity of brain circuitry, we really only know this because we were able to perform base experiments on the giant squid axon and build off of this knowledge. In a similar vein, the poisons produced by the molluscs, like those in the cone snails, for example, are typically very complicated, with a large number of different compounds. This is both a good and a bad thing from certain perspectives, depending on how you look at it. So one way you could look at it, one of the bad things, is that because cone snail toxins are so complicated and so chemically rich, it's really challenging to develop a comprehensive anti-venom, or some kind of counter-agent that can fully prevent all of the harmful effects. And from a different perspective, if you look at it a different way, one of the good things is that many of the individual compounds within the cone snail toxin are really specific. They have very specific mechanisms of action, or they only affect a very particular set of cells. One class of compounds, for example, the alpha conotoxins, bind exclusively to postsynaptic nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which prevents the muscles from contracting in response to an activating neural signal. Another class of molecules, the delta and mu conotoxins, bind exclusively to sodium channels, which prevents sodium ions from entering the cell, and thus disables the cell's ability to produce and propagate action potentials. By testing each individual compound, we've been able to learn a huge amount about not just the cone snail and its conotoxins, but also about specific receptors and the chemical dynamics of the action potential generally. Additionally, for any given compound that's isolated and extracted from the cone snail toxins, there may be a variety of non-harmful side effects that can be exploited for human benefit. For example, there's a small conotoxin peptide called ziconotide, which is derived from the omega conotoxin M7A variant. And according to a 2006 paper on the dangers of cone snail toxins to humans, ziconotide was described as, quote, a peptide that blocks the neuronal calcium canals with excellent effect in the treatment of chronic and severe painful processes, unquote. Basically, what this means is that this compound has an effect where it blocks some of the nociceptor signals or the pain signals from certain chronic pains, like body aches or arthritis or something like that. And so this potential medicinal effect could be developed and refined and potentially turn into a therapy one day. In addition to the medical value of their toxins, the mollusks are also helping us learn about ourselves and the world around us in countless ways. Seriously, they are super important in a variety of fields of research, not just neurology. For example, mollusks are home to a plethora of gut bacteria that produces various drug-like compounds that may have medicinal qualities. As the mollusk gut bacteria assist in their host's immune response, we've been able to make promising advancements in the development of antibiotics using compounds produced by these mollusk gut microbes. Due to their intelligence, octopus have played a critical role in research on animal learning and memory, as well as deficits in these abilities caused by neurodegeneration, injury, and disease. Similarly, due to their large eyes, cephalopods have been used as models for research on eye development, eye evolution, and ocular diseases. Fascinatingly, cephalopods can regenerate their eye tissue, so if they lose their eyes during a disease study or something, the individual animal can regenerate their eyes and be used again for another test, or it can be released into the wild without being handicapped. This trait is also the subject of research on induced ocular regeneration in humans. So, if I'm speaking a little theoretically here, sometime in the future, potentially the near future, like maybe the next 30 years, there could be a research team that makes a breakthrough in our understanding of cephalopod eyeball regeneration. They could apply the techniques they learned to human eyes, and perhaps develop a gene therapy or something that can induce regenerative processes in the retina, or the optical nerve, or the sclera and vitreous body, or whatever happens to be causing that particular patient's blindness. And this somehow regenerates the tissue and restores vision. This would be an amazing and incredible therapy, and you could see it having immediate uses in, say, soldiers who get blinded in combat, or car crash victims, or people who've suffered acid attacks or acid injuries that have left them blinded. There's huge therapeutic potential here. So when you think about what medical research could develop in the near future, stuff like this is really exciting. Beyond the eyes, the cephalopods, and the other mollusks for that matter, have many body parts that have inspired new technologies. For example, the primitive chitons have interlocking shell plates and a girdle coated in scales, and this has inspired the engineering of new types of flexible, reactive body armor. Several bivalve species have been the focus of research into wet-tolerant biological adhesives. Ongoing development projects seek to turn natural oyster adhesive into a human-safe glue to seal flesh wounds and hold together fractured bones. The octopus's many arms and their strange, curling, flexible, semi-independent way of moving has been inspiration for a new tentacle-like prosthetic, which has certain advantages in dexterity and flexibility over a more traditional hand prosthetic. The transparent shell of the blue-rayed limpet Patella pellucida has inspired the development of complex metamaterials that can scatter light in specific ways, and perhaps lead to innovative new screen technologies. Chitons have teeth at the tip of their radula that contain the iron mineral santabarbarite, a strong but lightweight substance that allows the chitons to graze on algae on rocks without suffering dental damage. The biological presentation of this Santa Barbarite has been described as akin to a human tooth or bone, composed of a high density of very small particles, suspended in a matrix of larger fibrous molecules. Researchers used biopolymers derived from the chitin teeth to create a new kind of ink for a 3D printer that dries into an ultra-hard but relatively lightweight, bone-like material that could be manufactured into a variety of products. This makes me think that it might have potential as a biologically safe, biodegradable material that could replace certain kinds of plastics. The cephalopods have beaks, which are often the only hard part on their entire body. The chemical composition of the beaks exhibits a smooth density gradient, with the densest, hardest part being at the tip of the beak, and the softer, spongier parts being at the base of the beak, where they act like shock absorbers. This design, where you have this smooth concentration or density gradient through a material, so one side might be soft and flexible and rubbery, while the other side might be really, really hard and firm, this design has inspired nanocomposite metamaterials that mimic that density gradient, which can be used as internal cushions or anchors that makes prosthetic limbs more comfortable and safer for the patient. This stuff can also be used to make synthetic cartilage for knee replacements, and is a biologically safe substrate for computers integrated into the body, like glucose sensors for diabetes patients. Really, the degree of inspiration for new technologies that mollusks have given us, it's honestly incredible. The technologies that are potentially coming out of these materials and physiologies inspired by the mollusks are groundbreaking and life-changing for the patients who receive them. It really is amazing stuff. Alright, let's take a breather and go over this brief look at the relationship between humans and mollusks. First and foremost, mollusks were food for early humans, an especially important food for boat-faring peoples moving along the coast. Humans found many uses for mollusk shells, including jewelry, currency, and art. The ink and the glandular secretions were harvested and used to make inks for writing and dyes for fabrics. The more mobile mollusks, particularly the large ones, became the stuff of myth and legend, serving as the basis for ocean gods, watery demons, spirit guardians, and cosmic travelers. Mollusk poisons, once avoided for the pain and death they could cause, are now the subject of medical research into pain relievers, antivenoms, anticonvulsants, and many other drug therapies. In fact, almost everything about the mollusks, from their arms and their eyes, to their scales and their armor and their intelligence, has inspired a cornucopia of research across multiple fields. In the modern day, the mollusks still enjoy the lingering legacy of ship-killing monsters, a la the giant squid, but they're also viewed in a very positive way. They're seen as extraordinarily alien creatures, unlike almost anything else in the world. And instead of being scary, this is really fascinating. And it's why, in the sciences, the mollusks have been recognized as particularly valuable creatures, both for their ecological and medical utility, but also for the engineering breakthroughs inspired by the composition or physiology of their beak, or their shell, or their arms. They are amazing creatures, and their value to us will only continue to grow as time goes on. Alright everyone, this is a good place to wrap it up. This has been a really fun look at the long and storied relationship between humans and mollusks, and it's the final episode in this series on the mollusk clade. Next up, we'll be moving along the protostome family tree by beginning a super series on the arthropods. The first series in this super series will explore the arachnids and their relatives. So if you're into spiders and scorpions, then you definitely want to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss an episode. Check out the show's Patreon page. Check out the official store. Tell your friends and family about the show. And as always, thank you for listening.